best I can do.
I apologize, I do have another 9 o'clock, believe it or not. I'm supposed to be retired. I don't know what the hell's happened, but...
Well, sir,
and I moved out here to hide a little bit, and now Bob's no help. Get my phone number out. Even the Rotary's got me. They don't know what they're in for.
I do have to tell you
yes, sir.
That my father, he was a colonel in the French and Indian War. So he clearly understood, and part of my background also was that I managed a number of the different committees in the Second Continental Congress relative to ensuring that the health and welfare of the military was being taken care of. So those are many things that people don't understand about myself, Samuel Adams. But I had a very direct role also in forming the militia, not only the Sons of Liberty, but forming the militia in Massachusetts and ensuring that the citizenry would take and learn military activity to protect their rights at home.
Well, you know what another disgrace is, Sam? Is that we don't teach this, apparently, in any of our schools at all. I don't comprehend. This is part of American history, and when you start talking about these things, because I give speeches there and at times, and these kids don't know anything.
You're right, sir.
Some of them don't know who George Washington is. It's like watching Jay Leno on the street or Letterman or whatever it's called, you know? It's a disgrace. I don't know why we can't, why isn't there more American history that covers this? Like, do you go to school, Sam?
Yes, sir.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yes, sir.
You know, I don't know much about Sam Adams. I got my curiosity out.
The real interesting thing was that I entered Harvard at the age of 14.
Wow.
Now, as I understand it, Harvard is so much different today than it was when I entered.
But you got to be a liberal lefty now, apparently. So you think you're out of Harvard.
There's many things that I understand that are different, and I appreciate a lot of the different conversation that I've heard this evening. And it really brings me back to that time of what was going on in the nation. Now, I understand this area, and I had the opportunity to go through along the other side of the river, if you will, as I was making my way to Philadelphia one day. And I know you have to run, but one of the things...
No, I would like to stay and listen. You're a better speaker than I am.
Well, I was known to captivate the crowd for a minimum of 5 hours, so I'm glad to...
I thought I had a loud mouth.
What was really interesting is that I understand as I've traveled around this nation now, which is so different than what it was in my day, that here on this island that was very sparsely populated at the time, actually has a population that is almost equal to all of the colonies. I understand that to be true. What is the population here, sir?
1.3. That's Suffolk.
That's
Suffolk County.
Yes, but when you combine, now I understand you have these counties. What is the population? Closer to 4 million, as I understand. Closer to 4 million. Yes, on the whole island. In my day, that was about the number of all the colonies combined. Now you see what the movement is. A couple of the monikers that I was left with, and history will stamp out, was I was called the father of the revolution. And a lot of it was because I was that firebrand. I still am. And taking and being that firebrand, it was the idea of what is liberty? And that's really what it comes down to. You said rights. Rights are very important. But you don't know your rights until they are tied to what is liberty. Because then are they expressed. And some of the things that we took and looked at as we were fighting was where did our liberties and our rights come from? Our Creator. It was well stated. Mr. Jefferson took that and wrote it very elegantly into the Declaration of Independence. In 1772, I wrote that in the Declaration and Rights of the Colonists as a response to many of the different things that were going on. Now, Samuel Adams, I understand in your history, you look at it from this gentleman that produces a beer. Well, I can tell you the stories of how my father left me that. But I think the real interesting things that really bring it together, what we have today, is different from what was happening in my time, was the idea that there was this movement that was going on. And it was called the First Great Awakening. And that's what your history is written about. You see, what happened was that there were certain ministers that came in to the United States, and some of the ones, as a matter of fact, I married the daughter, my first wife, and she passed, but my first wife was Elizabeth Checkley. And her father was a minister of one of the primary churches, and he spoke well, and he was part of that whole movement. And my sister actually knew and wrote and corresponded very much with one of the main ministers of the day. So there was this movement that happened, and all across the colonies where people became solidified was in their first understanding of where liberty came from. And liberty and our rights coming from God. So that set the first tone for what we were involved in. Yes, sir?
Was it more than you're talking about religious freedom? The first settlers coming over from England to a certain degree was...
More than that. We knew that. And we even talked, I talked about it, as a matter of fact, in my speech after the Declaration of Independence on the 6th of July. And I mentioned that very clearly, that now we have even restored the sovereign on his throne by this Declaration of Independence. But what it did is that there was this renewal, because there was a falling away of faith. Even from the time of the first settlers to that time when there was this great movement again within the various congregations all and up and down the colonies. And that restoration of faith also brought about then the restoration of the understanding of rights and sovereignty. Because I think that's a part of definition that we don't understand in your time, is what does it mean to be a sovereign? What does it mean to be a sovereign nation?
How did you reconcile your respect and for authority and all when you're breaking away from the king? And everyone was, as a country and a people, had a great respect for authority. I mean, that is a dramatic change from semi-dictatorship to a certain degree, where you're saying, now we all have these inalienable rights. That is an incredible jump, and I can see why people would remain loyal, because that's your king and so forth and so on.
True. There was a number of different things that were happening, and one of the ideas is that, just as I understand is happening in your political environment today, when we had our charters in the colonies, those charters were covenants. And that is another term that many people don't understand, is a covenant is that thing which has a solid foundation that is given by a sovereign, by which they will take and uphold their portion of it as well as we would uphold ours. Now, our covenant and our charters were with the king and not with Parliament. So when you look again at the Declaration of Independence were the charges against the king, but yet Parliament were the ones that were enacting a number of all these different acts that were subverting and usurping the authority that was granted to us with independent sovereign legislators that we would be able to have. So we had no legislative authority that was established in Parliament. That's why the cry many times on taxation was we had no representation. But our covenant was with the sovereign, the king. But we upheld always and foremost that God was our first and foremost sovereign. So although the king, under that idea, we were breaking away from that whole concept of the divine right of the king. So when we looked at that and said the king has a place of authority, and his authority is granted, again, by the people, especially after the various revolutions that happened in England itself, and under the English Constitution, we set that determination, and it gave us that whole baseline of rights that then we were able to establish and say, now, when we look at what is going on in America, and our covenant says that we have this right to our own legislatures, and most of the colonies did. As a matter of fact, we all did. And yet now, this usurpers called Parliament is going to come in and take and bring in these other forms of taxation, affect our Congress.
So that's what we call Congress now.
Sir, that is what we saw. And those were some of the things, because I was known as an anti-federalist.
So you could actually have been the do-everything Congress as opposed to do-nothing Congresses we've had for the last decade, or 15 or 20 years, that are paid an inordinate money and they go take visits to foreign countries and look at subways and crap on our dollar.
And some of the things that are different
I
about
I could be here all night.
some of the things that you do different today than what we did is we gave letters of instruction to our representatives. And you have to understand that I was also Secretary of State.
Right.
I was also elected as representatives into our legislature. I sat in the Senate, and I was the president of the Senate and the state
But you had
legislature.
the unanimous support of all the colonies. We can't even pass one piece of
It comes back
legislation
to what
here.
we were all saying earlier. It comes back to local government. What happens with that local government? And what I understand, your politicians come in and say, sir, I'm going to do this for you, and I'm going to do this for you. No, 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 that's not what we did. What we said is, here are the letters of instructions, and if you don't do what we, the people, say, you're not going to be reelected.
We re-elect them every year.
But that is something that people do just as a mechanical
Well, they're
item,
born.
instead of calling them back in and holding their feet to the fire.
That's why we're here.
These things that, happen, that one of the things my father, because he was down at the waterfront, we lived right on the waterfront, as you may know. And he started with the shipbuilders at that time, and they were called caulkers. And from that came the derivative then of what is now known as a caucus. So what we were doing, and my father was primarily doing, was some of that is helping to raise up some political leaders to the extent then that we could get people that had an understanding into the various offices of legislature. Now, when that continued to mature, what we saw now in your time is so different. It becomes this different type of motion and machine, as I would almost call it. We looked at the cogs and the wheels; those terms go back for a long period of time. But it comes back to the responsibility of the people coming together, large groups. At one time, when it came to that time that the tea ships came in to Boston Harbor, and they were coming in all over. New York took them up, took the tea and brought it into the city. Philadelphia did some of the same, but some of the others in the southern states did not, as well as Boston said, no way. And that's what we did. And we went and we tried to negotiate with the governor, but yet that was pushed on us, and that was part of what formulated. We had 4,000 people come together. That was the whole city of Boston. And it was standing through those hours of negotiation with the governor. Now, when did that time happen? When was what you now call the Boston Tea Party? When in the year, a month in the year was that? It was December. How many of you been to Boston in December? Yes. So when you have that many people that are willing to come out because they understand that it was a matter of sovereignty within Boston for Massachusetts. And I think that is what it is. It comes from that clear understanding of you are sovereign. 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 You all are. Under the grace of God, with liberty and your rights and how they're given. And it's getting the people, and I understand clearly, sir, that today the people do not understand that. They have not been educated in those basic fundamentals of their rights. They think their rights are whatever. You, sir, will you give me the right to that cookie?
Yeah, come on it.
So readily, you're willing to give his cookie. You're willing to.
I'll give you the cookie.
Oh, but the point, sir, was made. The point, sir, was made. The point, sir, was made. The willingness that has been taught to give that which does not belong to you to somebody else. You see, we didn't stand for that. We understood very clearly in our time that property is a very clear definition of what is who we are. Property is not only that ground that you walk upon, not only that shirt that you hold, it is what's in your head. That's why we had some of that put into the Constitution. It's your intellectual knowledge. It's what you make with your hands and you create, and then you're willing to trade with somebody else. Property is that essence of happiness. You see, that's why Mr. Jefferson put it that way.
Well, Obama wants everybody to be happy.
But on somebody else's
You have to
dime.
understand, we dealt with people like him. You see, they were called utopians. So when people say that we had no idea of the reality of what you're experiencing in this century, oh no, you have to remember what my cousin John said after the Constitution went into effect. And you have to understand that I did not sign off on the Constitution right away. I was, as I mentioned earlier, an anti-federalist. And the reason was because of rights, protecting the state's rights and protecting the individual rights. But what my cousin John said was very, very prophetic. You understand now, it was closer to 4.5, 5 million people by the time the Constitution actually came into being. But he said, this Constitution is good for over 300 million people. It was prophetic. Because as I understand today, in these United States, there are over 300 million people. So when someone tries to tell you that the Constitution was not that guideline, that document that could sustain through time and could sustain all of the ideas that would come about. You see, there's nothing new under the sun. I believe in Ecclesiastes it says, nothing new under the sun. And you have to remember, those that sat to form this Constitution that now you all hold to and call and dear and cherish, they understood many of these fundamental principles. Yes, ma'am.
Are you telling me that the fact that we put a man on the moon, that we have the internet, that we can blog and tweet and communicate all around the world in an instant, are you trying to tell me that did not change the basics of human nature as you knew them and as our founders knew them?
Oh, but you see, human nature is the same because prior to the Committee of Correspondence, which started tying all of the colonies together and corresponding from a political, from a cultural perspective. Everybody was in their own town, in their own newspapers. From time to time, a paper would go from place to place. But from developing that type of communication across and connecting those many lines, the Committee of Correspondence produced that same type of thing. Now, is it faster? Does it mean that you can move more information?
I don't think so.
True. But the fundamentals of who people are, if we understand and we agree that we have a creator that developed us in the first place and told us to go ahead and develop all that we could. But the basics of human nature was what I argued in particular. Now, my argument had always been, as an anti-federalist, from this perspective, and asking why we would guarantee those various rights, was from the idea that the Federalists took a very interesting position that as you would read and study and understand who they were as men in history, the position was that we would always produce good people because they had the position that the churches would always do their job. And we would always have a moral people that would stand on values and principle. Myself, Patrick Henry, and a number of others took, to your point, the nature of man. And we saw the nature of man because one of my other monikers was the last Puritan. So I had that fundamental of where my religious background came from. And so I took that different position in saying, I'm sorry, even within the context of the churches, I would see the potential for falling down. So we need to reserve our rights in a certain way. So the method of communication does not necessarily change the underlying values of who we are as created human beings and what we need to understand our liberties and that relationship with our heavenly sovereign, if I may. And then what that means is how we have relationships with people in our culture and in our nation. Excuse me. So one of the things that I did want to bring today, and I don't know how long ago, like I mentioned, we probably could interact for many hours. But I'm delighted to be with you today. This was a very important day, and more so tomorrow for me. Some of you may know what happened in this time in history in the month of April. April 19th. April 19th. You see, on the evening of April 18th, I was at Reverend Clark's house. And there was a guard out there. Now, many of you have heard that Paul Revere made his ride to warn Lexington and Concord that the British were coming because of what? To do what? Take the arms. Let me back you up just a little bit. You see, from that time that I graduated from Harvard, my graduation thesis, was on when is it that we should stand against the stopper and take a position against him in totality if everything else fails. And they, at that time, said, we have to watch this young Mr. Adams. So that was the beginning of how I felt and how my career in that whole political movement started happening in my day. My father had me go to work with Mr. Gushing as an accountant, I guess is what you called him today, but I was an accountant in an accounting house. Well, I have to tell you that my love and desire for liberty, based on all the things that were happening in our country, I was what I think you called fired from my first job. So that was just some of that. I had this love. I had to keep looking at all the things that happened. I could tell you many things. What happened to my father because of banking. So I understand banking. I understand the needs for medical care. I understand all of these different things that you're experiencing today. We experienced. We went through those same battles. We had an oppressive government that came on these same things. And I stood up. I could not be bought off. As we heard earlier, that now in Washington, which was part of a compromise from New York, many of you know here in where was our first seat of government? New York City. Yes. Now, what we see is that there was always something happening that a political person could be bought off. When General Gage took over for Governor Hutchinson as governor of Massachusetts, they tried to buy me off with freedom. They tried to buy me off with money and position, but I would not. I stood firm because I knew that the liberty of the nation was the most important thing that had to be secured. It was to the point then that Parliament actually then put a sentence on me at that time of death, as well as Mr. Hancock. John Hancock. Correct. The bounty was, and to the extent that every other patriot that participated would have been pardoned, except for Mr. Hancock and myself. Okay. So that was the penalty, and I believe there is this means of communicating stories that you have now, that you can actually watch the story. And one of the things that I understand that you had a story of was Mr. Wallace, William Wallace. The type of penalty that Mr. Wallace went under was still the same judgment for treason that Mr. Hancock and I were under. So you have to understand, we knew what the penalty was for standing. So here we are.
It was the same country executing the Patriots.
Yes, sir. So here we are, April 18th, and that evening at Reverend Clark's house. General Gage finally got the word from Parliament saying that it was imperative for them to take and secure Mr. Hancock and myself. General Gage actually thought, in sending this battalion, if you will, that he would take and have Mr. Hancock and I in irons that next day, sitting before him, and he was rather gleeful. I can tell you a story another time that 2 battalions were actually named after myself, but that's another story. But here we are. This military front, first mission, sir, was not to secure the powder at Lexington and Concord. Their first mission, because they got word, was to go secure Mr. Hancock and myself, and then take the powder and arms. Mr. Revere came, and the guard was put up, and he was stopped at the house, and he said, "No, I have to enter now. I have to make this warning because the Redcoats are only several miles down the road." And the only reason they didn't get there within a 2-hour time period was because they were so confident in what they were doing that they stopped. So Mr. Hancock and I were awakened, and we were on our way then early in the morning because people were, "Oh no, this isn't happening." So by the time 1 o'clock came, there was some assembly. By the time 2 o'clock came, there was a great assembly, and the British weren't arriving. So at that point, we said, "Okay, we'll dismiss the Minutemen for now, but be ever ready. Be those Minutemen." And about 6 o'clock in the morning, myself and Mr. Hancock then started heading to War Room because we knew that we could be secure there. So we had a small contingent that would go with us. But shortly after that, we weren't too far down the road when we heard the alarm sounding. I was walking through the dew of the field. I was excited like I've never been before. And I heard the shots. I heard the shots. I did look up, and all of that excitement, and all that I saw with that sun on that morning dew, I said, "Oh, this is such a glorious morning." Knowing what was going on, but knowing that we were now on the first front of securing our liberty as an independent nation. So I am very delighted to be here with you this evening, and knowing that tomorrow was that day that those shots were heard that went around the world and started our liberty. Yeah.